Thank you very much, Anna and Gilberto, for this workshop and the opportunity to hear from others. This is a paper that I've been working on with colleagues from the University of Auckland who can't be here today, Ritesh Shah and his doctoral student Daniel Couch, thanks to the auspices of this project. So we've been working in the education sub-theme, I guess, within the Resilient Peace Project. And it's been fascinating for us, I think, to learn more about resilience as a concept. It's not, Ritesh has done a bit of work on resilience prior to this engagement, and I haven't really, so it's so useful to hear more kind of theorization and conceptual work around resilience. And that's, I was saying to Maria today, so this is like the paper will tell you where we've got to with the empirical work, and we're working on the conclusions right now and really trying to get more familiar with resilience literature. So this is very nice. So what we've been doing with this paper is trying to see how resilience is articulated within this area of education and emergencies, this community that's interested in delivering education to crisis-affected communities, contexts, countries, etc. And education and emergencies itself is something that has really risen over the last 20 or so years, and that's the focus of this workshop next Friday that Gilberto mentioned that you're all very welcome to attend if you'd like to. And so education, there's quite a bit of scholarship recently on how education and emergencies went from something that historically wasn't seen as a major global issue to something that last month Will Smith did this big global international bungee jump for, supporting a forum called Education Cannot Wait, which is a big multi-donor fund to try to generate money for delivering education to displaced refugee and conflict-affected communities. And the kind of charting of how education and emergencies has become this big global priority talks about how in the mid-1990s to 2000s, there was a lot of coming together of different actors to think about the problem of education for crisis-affected communities and to develop, to move from this kind of place where people were doing this sort of work, but not in an organized or coordinated way, to really thinking about standards, the need for global activism and agency around these issues, and also for the development of guidelines and minimum standards and things. So this period of what Winthrop and Matsui call in the mid-1990s to 2000s consolidation around education and emergencies, to the present period, which they call a collaborative education and emergencies. So very outward-oriented, activist, engaged, working with other sectors, education and emergencies, that has consolidated this kind of consensus around the real importance to deliver education to conflict-affected communities. And that's led to consensus and networks of what Mica Lopez Cardoso and Mario Novelli call unlikely bedfellows. So we see the World Bank with agendas like you've described, working closely with UN institutions that are more rights-based priorities. We see increasing philanthrocapitalists engaging in education and emergencies, especially in this Education Cannot Wait umbrella. Security and military actors using schools to win hearts and minds as part of counterinsurgency efforts. Also participating in the Interagency Network for Education and Emergencies, which is this sort of umbrella organization that brings together all of these actors. So we see actors with conflicting agendas agreeing, or potentially conflicting agendas, slightly different agendas, different priorities, agreeing that education is a huge priority. And we see a merging of humanitarian development, securitization, disaster risk reduction, and sort of venture capitalist privatization discourses all coming together to say education is really important. Of course, these have different ideas about what that education would look like, why it's important, what its purposes are, and that's really interesting for us. And we're interested in how resilience enters into this consolidated, collaborative version of education in emergencies. And we had this suspicion, we sort of started with hypotheses and moved them to research questions, but we had this suspicion, given the way that resilience has risen within wider processes of peace building, and given our own involvement with education and emergencies since the kind of early 2000s, that there probably wasn't that much use of resilience in those early days, and now it's rising up the agenda. So that was our first question. And then our second question was, okay, if resilience is becoming more prominent within education and emergencies, how is it conceptualized? How is it used? What different forms of resilience are imagined? And then our third question, what are the implications? Which I'm not going to talk about today, because like I say, we're kind of doing that work now and really eager to think that through with this network. So just very briefly, what we did is we had a first phase where we collected documents from organizations and agencies who are publishing and writing about their strategies for education in emergencies primarily. And then we did a frequency count within those documents. So we started from 1990 and went up to the present day, just looking for resilience, blah, blah. And then we selected a smaller sample of documents focused in the period where resilience is most used, which I'll show you what that period is. It's not a big surprise. And we did a more qualitative textual analysis to try to answer those questions around how resilience is conceptualized. So our first finding supports hypothesis one, that resilience is really something that's come into the discourse of education in emergencies since the sort of since 2010 is when it really hits the scene, if you can see this graph. So your orange columns are average use of resilience in documents in each of the 5-year periods that we looked at, and then the blue is the number of relevant documents in that period. So you can see an increase in the use of resilience over the period. And probably the most kind of demonstrative indication of the way in which resilience has really become a concept that's mobilized and used a lot within education in emergencies is the minimum standards. So this is a document that was key in that consolidation phase that I talked about, where actors came together and said, okay, we need to get education onto the agenda. We need to think about how we do education in emergencies. The first draft of the minimum standards was released in 2004. It alongside the Declaration of Education as a fourth pillar of humanitarian response. So that was a really key victory for this community to say that education is something that's not just developmental, it's the responsibility of humanitarian actors to deliver education to crises-affected communities. That first 2004 version of the minimum standards has no mentions of resilience, 0. The 2010 second edition has 10. So, and there's not, I should say how many words there are in the document. It's not a hugely wordy document, so 10 mentions of resilience makes it a fairly central concept within the revised 2010 minimum standards. So that kind of indicates the degree to which resilience is now a fairly key part of the education in emergencies agenda, whereas it was something that was not discussed at all when these priorities were first kind of identified and thought through in terms of how this global international community would deliver education to crises-affected communities. Promoting resilience in any way was not something that was part of that initial minimum, the initial kind of minimum thing that should happen for these children and young people. So that's the answer to, well, the kind of findings around that first question. And around the second question, we've started to, these are conceptualizations that have emerged from the qualitative textual analysis with, like I say, not a huge amount of familiarity with the literature around resilience. So that's what we need to do now, is kind of think about how these terms map onto varieties of resilience, like you just told us about in other literature and resilience. But we see the kind of main conceptualization within the work that we've reviewed is around the idea of resilience as this kind of resource that can be developed. And we've got an additional column that I didn't put onto the slide because it was just illegible, but around resilience for who? So that's another question that we're asking. So in this resilience for resource as a resource category, it's interesting what the subject or the object of resilience is conceptualized as. And it's often the individual, particularly the individual student or the individual teacher, who are meant to kind of withstand crises and develop their capacities to bounce back better, like you say, or to sort of get on with, with the difficulties that they're facing in their education. But there's also some mention of schools increasing their resiliency, and very occasionally education sectors as resilient. But again, mostly we're talking about the conflict-affected teacher and student as the person who should, or the people who should become more resilient thanks to interventions that education actors might do. We also see a smaller number of documents that are looking at resilience as a transformative concept. And again, there's a distinction there between the process of developing resilience as somehow transformative and something that can perhaps improve the quality of education sectors or the quality of the delivery of education more generally. So seeing education as something, cool. Or seeing resilience as something that can contribute to a wider process of change within education on a sector-wide level, or this kind of resilience, or transformative resilience as a disposition that's made possible by some kind of enabling conditions that the international community might support. And finally, there's some conceptualization of resilience as as a continuum, maybe leaning towards the ecological perspective that our first speaker was mentioning, particularly coming from UNESCO IIEP in this case. So there are these different conceptualizations, and we're going to come up with some implications.